All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar titled Closing the Carbon Market Gap. So the carbon market is one of the most important tools we have to fight climate change because it enables folks to offset their harder to abate emissions that they can't reduce through the purchase of carbon offsets. So today I'm really excited to speak with two experts in the carbon offset project space to discuss efforts to close the supply and demand gap, challenges in developing projects and issuing credits at scale, and then the technologies that they're optimistic about, co-benefits of carbon projects, and mitigating the risks of leakage. So I'm moderating your session today. My name is Nicole Sullivan. I'm the Director of Climate Services at Carbon Better, and I'm an environmental engineer by trade. So here at Carbon Better, we help folks with every step of their sustainability journey, from quantifying their impacts, setting a roadmap, reporting out on their impacts, and ultimately reducing their impacts through decarbonization, including through the purchase of carbon offsets. Before I hand it over to our guest speakers to introduce themselves, I would like to call your attention to the questions feature. So throughout the session, you can ask questions as you have them, and then we will work to answer questions at the end. I also want to let you know that each of our backgrounds has a QR code that will take you to the speaker's LinkedIn page so that you can connect with them. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Dan Linsky of ClimeCo to introduce himself.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Dan Linsky at ClimeCo. ClimeCo is a project developer. We develop and manage carbon emission reduction projects here in the United States and starting to be more global. We also have a advisory team that advises clients on setting sustainability goals and reporting to CDP and all that kind of thing. And then a transactions team that actually offers the credits that are produced to the market and to buy and sell other credits in the market. So great to be here. Excited that Nicole invited us to speak, and looking forward to the rest of the webinar.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dan. Next, I will hand it over to Julius Pasay of the Climate Trust.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And Nicole, thank you for inviting me to join. It's great to be here speaking with you and Dan. My name is Julius Pasay. I'm the Executive Director at the Climate Trust. The Climate Trust is a nonprofit based in Oregon. We work nationally, though. And as far as I know, we're the oldest carbon entity in the nation. We got our start 25 years ago when Oregon passed the first legislation mandating that new energy facilities had to offset emissions. And that was before any of these carbon registries existed. So our early days were really focused on helping develop a market, writing protocols and standards to help get a market off the ground so we could deploy that funding. And since then, we've really grown and evolved along with the carbon markets. Over the last 5 to 10 years, we really started focusing on project finance and development, and are now really focused on developing nature-based climate solution projects and helping to finance them. Excited to speak to you about all that's going on here in carbon markets.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julius. So before we dive into kind of the nitty-gritty of our discussion today, we just kind of wanted to level set on where we're really at today. So you've all seen the headlines everywhere. Every day, corporations and governments alike are making new net zero commitments, but can those commitments be achieved? So carbon offset supply will need to grow by around 50 times by 2050 to achieve net zero emissions, and we have to close the gap. So we're going to talk about this in detail with questions for our panelists, but we just kind of wanted to set the stage there, and also take a look at just where we're at CO2 emissions wise globally. So to reach net zero, we have to decrease emissions by about 1.4 gigatons of carbon dioxide each year. So that's a lot. So, come into this with that baseline. And with that, let's dive in. So Julius, can you talk us through what it takes to bring a carbon offset project to market?
Sure. It's very complicated. Takes a fair amount of time. We kind of have to first start with knowing what some of the methodologies and registries are that are out there. What actually makes a carbon offset and how you account for that. And that takes into account a lot of questions about permanence of that offset. If you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, how long it stays out of the atmosphere. Additionality, is this actually a benefit to the climate that's beyond what would have happened otherwise? Is your project actually having that impact? So they can be pretty complicated. And that first step is knowing the methodologies. Sometimes the carbon markets are still evolving and developing. So sometimes the methodology, which is those rules for specific action and how you account for it, doesn't necessarily exist. So you may have to start from scratch and design a methodology. There's a number that are being reviewed right now and will be coming online. And then if you don't need to do that, or you do, but or one's coming online, you need to pick which one you need. If there's some that you can choose from. And once you do that, you need to know how to do a feasibility study. And so you have to conduct a feasibility study to see if it's worth investing money up front. These projects take several years to get off the ground. They cost a lot of money up front. So can you model out how many offsets are going to be generated over time to make that basically investment decision, whether or not it's worth it to pursue that project? And there's a lot of factors that go into that. And there's a number of developers out there who have experience developing projects. That's part of kind of the ecosystem of the carbon markets. But once you can identify kind of a match to the project, a methodology match to the project you're working on, or the projects you want to work on, you have to start doing outreach to those potential project owners. Mm-hmm. And I think I'll probably mention this a few times throughout our time today, but carbon markets are new. And so there's not a lot of knowledge out there about them. People don't understand the language that we use, and we try not to be jargony, but there is a lot of jargon. And so that outreach can take a long time to explain things to a landowner. And then when you get to the phase of contracting a project, you might have to educate their attorneys for another 6 months. And so that takes a long time. And then once you do all that, that's when you can start developing a project. And so you have to list a project with the registry. Those registries ensure there's no double counting, and they, you've identified which methodology you're going to develop it to, what standard. Then you have to do the actual development, which could mean a lot of different things depending on the project, and do all of the carbon modeling and accounting, and get all the documents to prove eligibility and show that what you're doing is above business as usual. Once you have all those documents together, you have to work with a third-party verifier. All of these verifiers out there are accredited by ANSI to the methodology at the registry. So there's a high level of standardization and high standards they all have to meet to be a third-party auditor. And so then you have to kind of manage and contract that process of verification. Once that's complete and you've addressed all the issues that your third-party auditor finds, we do call that verification. That's some more of that jargon I was talking about. Then the registry has to review that project. And again, the registry is who set the rules and set up that methodology. So they're going to look at what you said. They're going to look at what the third-party auditor said. And then if they may find some other things you need to address before they issue credits. And then hopefully you get your credits issued and you can start marketing and selling them, or finish up marketing and selling them, which you've probably started in advance.
For sure.
So there's, again, specifics are all dependent on each of those specific methodologies.
Yeah, no, it's a lot of steps. It's a complicated space. I think people always wonder, well, why aren't there just more readily available carbon credits? But it takes a lot to bring those credits to market, and it's a lot of effort. And to your point, it's time consuming. Dan, can you dig in a little bit on how long it actually typically takes to bring credits to market on a new project?
Yeah, so ClimeCo, we develop a lot of industrial type of projects where we destroy greenhouse gases on those projects. So in those types of projects, it'll take, as Julius described, maybe 12 to 18 months to develop the project. By the time you either put it in a certain methodology, have it get all the pieces together, install the technology that you're going to need, get the project listed and all that, it takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months. And then once the project starts, you usually want to let it go for a year. If you have to verify, and verifications in some of these are quite expensive. So you want to accumulate as many credits as you can before you do the verification, just to make it the best investment you can. So let's say a year or two after that first 12 to 18 months, maybe another year, the project is running and reducing emissions, but you're not issuing credits yet because you haven't done a verification. Then you do a verification, which used to, once the verification started, it used to be maybe 4 to 6 weeks to issue credits. Now it's more like 3 to 6 months. The registries, God bless them, they do a great job at what they do, but they're just overworked. There's a lot more projects now. A lot of their people move to carbon companies, and so there's a lot of new people at the registries, and so it's just taking longer to get credits issued once you put verification reports in. So 3 to 6 months to get the credits issued after the verification report. So you're looking at probably 2 years after you actually start the project before you issue your first credits. Then after that, it's pretty much however often you want to verify, right? So if you wait a year, so it'd probably be annual verifications and issuances after that. Some projects that are even more expensive, like some forestry projects, you might wait longer. Unless you need to monetize those to keep the project going, you might wait longer to do the verification because those are really expensive, forestry project verifications. So, in reforestation, a typical reforestation project under traditional methods, maybe you plant the trees and then because they're so small, they're not sequestering much carbon. You probably wouldn't verify. It wouldn't be worth verifying for maybe 10, 11 years to issue credits because you're going to have very small volumes in a small sapling being sequestered. So that's why a lot of reforestation projects go through this whole cycle and then wait another 10 years before you can actually sell a credit. Is kind of a long time for a project developer to make it worthwhile. Now in some of the ex-ante methodologies that are out there, you can start to monetize that a year after planting. So you put your trees, you list your project, put your trees in the ground, wait a year to be sure that they surpass a certain survival rate, and then have it verified by a third party, and then issue the credits for the project's lifetime. So project developers are starting to be more apt to do that because they can actually see some return in say 2 to 3 years instead of having to wait 10, 12 years, which nobody was willing to do. So I think reforestation really is an important step if we're going to if we're going to look towards removal credits and trying to hit that 1.5 degrees. Everything is necessary, and everybody's shied away from reforestation because it was too long to wait to get some payback on the project. So.
For sure. So I think the general theme that everyone will pick up on is it is effort intensive to develop projects. It is time intensive, and then it also can be financially intensive as well. But we're going to talk about ways to help kind of reduce that effort or close that gap. So with that, Julius, can you talk about opportunities you're seeing to optimize project development efforts and timeframes?
Sure. Yeah. I think Dan just had one really good example of that ex-ante crediting for buyers that are open to purchasing those types of credits. That's one great way, especially for reforestation, to optimize timeframes. I think some of the big challenges right now are, as Dan mentioned, that a small pool of experienced professionals working in the carbon space, because it's really kind of exploded and taken off in the last couple of years. What was a small community is rapidly expanding, and so there's a lot of demand for the professionals that were there before the last couple of years, and so we've seen a lot of movement from the registries or developers to other groups. So that's part of the reason I think we're seeing a delay with verifiers or going through verification, going through registry review. It's just there's a lot more projects, and also people. There's a lot of people working in carbon markets are new and still getting up to speed because they are very complicated. So I think that's one issue that's going to address itself, I think, as more people enter the market, though. And then the other one is what I mentioned before. It's just we're still in a phase of, I think, it's becoming more mainstream to understand carbon markets, but there's still a lot of unfamiliarity with carbon markets and how they work. And for us, when we develop projects, a big time hurdle for us is explaining those carbon markets to the landowner or project owner and then their attorneys. Getting them comfortable with entering into the market and signing on to a decades-long or centuries-long commitment for their land. I mean, that's a big hurdle for folks. These commitments to sequester carbon, if you're nature-based, they're significant commitments you're making to the registry, to the developer you're working with, and to the end buyer. And so that's part of why, this decision-making process takes a long time, because these are really, without those real commitments, we wouldn't be able to sell carbon credits. But the market is certainly maturing again. People are becoming more familiar with it. There are more consultants out there who can lend their expertise. And so I think we're going to, that hurdle is going to be overcome. In terms of other opportunities to kind of optimize, there are some efforts. There are a number of registries right now that exist. There is some overlap with them. And so there are a number of efforts right now to kind of increase liquidity and fungibility in the markets by kind of either making meta registries that help track overall, or, coming up with some agreed upon, kind of core carbon principles. Because I think also, in addition to landowners having a big step up to commit to a project, buyers also are trying to navigate this market, and it is complex for them, especially if they're new to the market. And so I think some of these efforts to make things a little more clear for buyers is also going to help us with timeframes and just moving this market along. Because sometimes when you're developing projects, you do sometimes want to have some buyers lined up or some upfront investment in projects. And that due diligence process on the buyer side can sometimes really delay things and take a long time. So I think we're getting there. It's happening. A lot of folks are working on this. But we've got a really strong foundation with the registries that we've been working with over the last few years. They've set up some great protocols that we can really rely on, and we're just trying to build on that now.
Definitely. And to your point, I think education is kind of at the core of all of our jobs, right? Like both on the buying side and the developing side, because this market is more opaque than it maybe should be. And so everyone's learning and getting up to speed and wanting to invest in the right projects. With that, so both of your organizations have been around for over a decade. Julius, can you talk a little bit about the increase in demand that you're seeing lately for credits?
Sure. Yeah. At my intro slide, I was saying Climate Trust, we started this work in '97 when there really weren't carbon registries. Yeah. So in those early days, we had funding from those energy facilities to offset emissions, and we had to go figure out how to do that in a meaningful way. And so there was, talking about demand, there was, I think we were some of the only demand at that time. And then over the years, we've worked with other buyers. There were not that many of them, especially in the voluntary market. And so you would be very hesitant to go start a project if you didn't have a buyer who was probably already contractually committed to buying some of those offsets, because you'd be taking a really big risk. The compliance market with California, with their cap and trade program, they allow offsets as part of that. They started, around 2012, 2011. And so that increased some demand on that end, because they were mandated to reduce their emissions, and they could buy some offsets, only around 8% at that time. It's reduced since then to their total reduction. So that created some extra demand, but only for projects that were developed in accordance to California's rules, which were a little different than the voluntary market. In the last few years, I'd say kind of ramping up in 2020, we saw, a whole host of corporations, not just energy utilities, but Fortune 500s, breweries, even individuals making, net zero commitments or carbon reduction commitments. And part of that strategy was to buy offsets to help them meet that. Some of the areas that are really hard to abate in their operations, they would need to buy offsets for that. So we saw a big uptick in demand for offsets over the last few years.
Awesome. Thank you. Dan, what about increased competition? So we're obviously all in this together as we work to save our planet, but is there a spirit of collaboration amongst your competitors as y'all work to bring projects to market?
Yeah, it's really a cool market as far as that goes. And I think it's for two reasons. One, what Nicole, at the beginning of the webinar, you said we needed to reduce an average of how much per year to get to net zero?
I think it's 1.4 gigatons.
Okay. So, and then I think I know this number. I probably should have looked it up before the webinar, but what is the carbon market trading annually?
Ooh, I should know that too, but the
It's like
number is
96
escaping
million.
me.
It's right around 100 million tons a year, right? I remember it went from like 96 to a little, we were excited it cost over 100 a year or
Yeah,
so ago. So it's right
and
around 100 million tons out of 1.4 gigatons.
right. So I think the
So
market has to grow by 50x, right? Which
exactly. So, and those numbers kind of line up to that. Exactly.
mhm,
So if ClimeCo was the only, we had no competition, there's no way we're going to get there. Right.
right.
So we all realize that ClimeCo does a project type in the N2O abatement space that nobody else in the US does. And, Climate Trust is great at the nature-based projects that they are taking care of. And so what happens, right? If I need a project, if one of my clients is looking for a type of credit that I don't have, that we don't produce, then I can go to somebody like Julius or some of the other competitors out there and say, hey, I need, this vintage, this project type from Michigan or whatever. And because I know they do those projects, and they say, yeah, sure, we'll offer them to you so you can offer them to your client, right? And there's a real lot of collaboration amongst each other in that regards. It's also competitive. I mean, if it's a bid situation, I want to win it like any other industry. But I think there's a lot more collaboration in this industry because of what we face as a planet, and because we're nowhere near getting there yet. Offsets are and the market-based solution is a big part of the solution, but it's not even the way it stands right now. If that's all there was, we can't get there anyway. So we have to do our part. This is the more projects, the better. We applaud each other for the project successes that we get, and I kind of like that because I've been
It's
in
really
industries in
cool.
the past that not that way at all. So this is pretty cool.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So before we dig even further, I do want to kind of level set that not all carbon credits are created equal. So a carbon offset credit represents 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent removed, sequestered, avoided, or reduced. But there's a lot of different technologies out there. There's a lot of different ways to develop those credits. And so you do still have to compare credits and assess those credits for quality. Dan, can you walk us through what is a quality carbon offset to you?
Yeah, thank you for that question because quite recently, I'd say in the last 6 months, we've been seeing a term used that says high quality carbon offsets, which I've been in this industry since 2005. Never heard that term really used as often as it is now. So, but nobody has a definition for what is that high quality. What do they consider a high quality offset?
Mhm.
But the term's being used. So this will be my opinion.
Sure.
For a high quality or a quality carbon offset should focus on the reduction of 1 ton of CO2e, right? One that did it reduce a ton of CO2, and was it additional, right? Should this have been done anyway? Is it business as usual? Is it already regulated? If any of those are the case, then no, it shouldn't be a carbon offset, right? Because you had to do it anyway.
Hmm.
Is it permanent, right? What's the likelihood of this ton of carbon being emitted at some time in the future, right? Or is it a permanent reduction, avoidance, removal?
Yep.
Uh, is there leakage? Okay, you've done this project, you've protected this forest, but you're going to cut down the forest right next to it, right? So that's
Mhm.
leakage. All right, you're just going to move the emissions from here to somewhere else. If that's the case, it's not quality. Is it third party verified? If not, and you're kind of doing your own checking the boxes as a project developer, that really doesn't work. There's no verification. And is it on a reputable registry? I think Julius alluded to that quite a bit earlier.
Mhm.
Is
And
it
I've
on a
just flashed a
reputable?
slide of some of
Oh,
that
nice
for everyone
timing.
to
Good
read.
timing. It's like we rehearsed this or something.
Something
Uh,
like that.
yeah. So yeah, is it on a reputable registry? So I think that's really crucial because they have the methodologies in place that have been peer reviewed and time tested and tweaked along the way already,
Hmm.
so that you can feel confident. Now, there's a lot of other preferences by buyers that come into effect. Geography, right? We have a plant in China, so I'd like to offset some of our emissions with projects in China, right? Project type. We're an industrial company. We would like to use industrial projects, or hey, we're outdoors company. we're sports, outdoor sports, so we want to support a nature-based project, right? Something that fits our story.
Mm-hmm.
That's all preference and all good stuff, but it doesn't, to me, speak to the quality of the offset. I think the quality of the offset was, did this reduce a ton of carbon? And is it additional? Is it permanent? Is it third-party verified? Does it take care of leakage? Is it on a reputable registry? Those, to me, are the things that we should focus on as far as, is it a quality offset? And all those other things are important, but they're more preferences.
Mm-hmm.
A project in New York and a project in California, the geography shouldn't matter as far as the quality goes of the offset. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much, Dan. So I think we're all seeing that, carbon credits obviously play a key role in decarbonization strategy, both for harder to abate emissions, as well as, it takes planning to do direct decarbonization activities at your facility. So carbon credits are also a tool to bridge that gap as you work to implement other strategies. But I want to touch on quickly with you, Julius, whether carbon credits can do more than just address carbon. Can you kind of walk us through the concept of co-benefits?
Yeah, happy to. And that's a great question. And Dan was starting to allude to that as well. So, you're getting a carbon credit from a project that's doing something. And that project, the impacts of that project are spinning off other benefits too that are not necessarily quantified in the way we're quantifying carbon. So we call those co-benefits. We do try to quantify them if possible. There's no accounting framework yet. I think there probably will be at some point to quantify those benefits. So we usually qualify our projects and really try to explain that those co-benefits. So a great example, the Climate Trust, we're really doing a lot of grassland conservation projects in the U.S. right now, and for those projects, we're working with ranchers in rural communities that are committing to permanently protect in perpetuity that property from ever being turned into cropland. And we're working, and what it is right now is they're grazing animals, but it's a native grassland, right? So there's hundreds of species of native wildflowers there and plants, and dozens of bird species and mammals and reptiles and insects that are dependent on those intact ecosystems to survive. In the U.S., we've done a great job of protecting forest land, have not historically done a great job of protecting grassland. I think in the early days when we were doing those forestry, that forestry protection, I think people thought, oh, it's just grass. There's nothing there. But they're really extremely rich and biodiverse. And so for those projects, and all these areas are, as Dan was mentioning, in terms of additionality, they're under threat of conversion. You could easily crop them, and a landowner would make a lot more money cropping that land rather than grazing it. But moving into the co-benefits, there's excellent wildlife and habitat and biodiversity benefits to conserving those grasslands, and there's great water quality benefits because if you're not tilling soil, you're not creating any sedimentation into our waterways. And so that's helping maintain high water quality. And then a lot of other projects, they may be creating jobs, depending on what type of project it is. And depending on where you're located, they might be reducing other types of pollution that are not CO2, but other types of, pollution that affect, people in terms of asthma or anything like that. A lot of our forestry projects and the grasslands too, but typically our forestry projects often also have, recreational benefits. So they're often public access might be required on a project. And that's, creating that opportunity for the surrounding community. So those are, some of the examples that we typically see on our projects. And the market does recognize that. So, I think we're going to talk about some pricing and things in a little bit, but, just a preview of that is that a lot of these nature-based projects, because of those co-benefits that are not necessarily quantified, but you're definitely causing those benefits, we do see that in, usually a premium on pricing for that. Just one last note, I think we're really focused here on greenhouse gas mitigation, right? Mitigating the effects of climate change, reducing climate change, reducing concentrations of GHGs in the atmosphere. But we're already seeing the effects of climate change, right? And so projects with, one of the things I'm excited about for our nature-based ones, and the nature-based projects in general, is that, we need to start doing things about climate change resilience and adaptation. And so the nice thing about these projects is they do build in resilience and adaptation to climate change in ecosystems. That is going to become increasingly important.
Yep, agreed. Thank you so much, Julius. So we've talked a little bit so far about grasslands, reforestation, and N2O abatement. But Dan, what is an emerging decarbonization technology that you're passionate about, and why?
Yeah, there's a couple that we are outside of the ones that we've been developing for years that we've already discussed. We still at ClimeCo want to work in the industrial space. It seems like it's a space that maybe some others, it's not as obvious, or some others it's hard to break into, but there's a big impact in some of those areas. So we are working on some of the things that we're passionate about, decarbonizing shipping. So that's actually, large tankers, et cetera, that a lot of fuel is used, and it's in the ocean. There's a lot of people that want to have the ability to support emission reductions that take place in the ocean. So that's one we're very excited about that we've got started, and cement, another industry that really is high emitting, and there's some opportunities to really make a big impact in cement, emissions from cement that we're working on. And why are we so passionate about those things that can make an impact? Well, I live in Florida, and about a month ago, a really, really, really strong hurricane hit the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast, but that storm, nobody even knew it was coming till like 2 or 3 days, 3 or 4 days, whatever it was, before the storm even formed. And they saw it starting to form. Usually when it forms in the Caribbean like that, it might hit as a category 1 or 2. The ones that come across from Africa that you can watch for a week and a half, those are the ones that usually grow. And this thing, they predicted it right. But I mean, from seeing it form in the Caribbean to when it hit, it got to a category 4 and annihilated, parts of the West Coast of Florida that won't be the same for a couple of years. And then after that, my little town got hit here by a hurricane in November. We haven't had a hurricane hit the U.S. in November in, I think it was decades when I saw it on the news. And yet another hurricane, now it wasn't anything like that other one, thank God. But I mean, that's how I personally see the effects. And then there's other people with droughts and floods, and, Kentucky floods and droughts in California. And I mean, we're seeing it. So if we're not passionate about it and we're in the industry, you got it. It's a cool thing in this industry that it's not just a job. There's most people that are in it are pretty passionate about it.
Definitely. And it's exciting to hear that y'all are working on solutions in both shipping and cement. I mean, those heavy industrial components, being able to reduce emissions there, is so impactful. So I'm excited to watch what y'all do there.
Yeah.
Thank you. So as we fill the gap with projects, right, it takes all different technologies. We've got industrial projects, we've got nature-based solutions. Are there technologies that y'all see as more scalable and executable, knowing that y'all both work in slightly different angles in this space? Julius, maybe let's start with you here.
Sure. Yeah. I so what we've really been working on, again, nature-based stuff, but the two that we're trying to really bring to scale is grassland conservation and reforestation or afforestation. I think both of those types of projects, they don't generate quite as many credits as more typical forestry projects where you're working with a standing forest and you're reducing harvest levels. So they're a little bit harder to finance. And as a nonprofit, some of our, one of our big missions, not some, but one of our main goals is to demonstrate scalable carbon finance. We feel like we're in that space where we can take some of those risks and really demonstrate how to do some of those projects to scale things up. So our two focuses right now are scaling grassland conservation, working with a lot of ranchers and those types of communities across the country to help with that conservation, with the goal of really scaling up the pace of conserving grasslands in the country. And then reforestation, we just were awarded a $15 million grant from the USDA, a Climate Smart Commodities grant, that
Awesome.
we want to use to pilot how to do this carbon finance with reforestation, afforestation. As Dan mentioned earlier, because trees grow so slowly, that's a really overlooked area and project type, because it, the payback is really, really low. It's a really high upfront capital cost and slow tree growth. And if you were planting them just for timber, that's a long wait before you can harvest those trees. But even for carbon, it's a long time for those trees to start growing and for you to see any type of return on your investment. So we're really looking to use that grant. Big thank you to the USDA for that, to demonstrate how to do that with landowners across the country. We'll be looking to, again, add a lot of co-benefits to it. So we want to focus on wildfire restoration in the West and a lot of afforestation in the Southeast. So I do think there's a lot of potential there. And we're not the only folks working on it either. So folks are trying to scale that up.
Fantastic.
That's exciting. That's exciting to hear about, Julius. I wasn't aware of the grant, so congrats.
Yeah, congrats.
We're pumped. All the staff is very excited. So
Yeah,
awesome. Dan, do you want to speak to things more on the industrial side?
Sure. So we kind of had our start with N2O abatement at nitric acid plants. And good timing again, Nicole. That's our CEO, Bill Flutterback, at a installation of a technology that destroys N2O, breaks it down into N2 and O2 before it goes off the stack as a waste stream. It's not regulated. It's not the norm that it's abated. So to put one of those systems in place, and this is actually one of a smaller system, you actually have to cut into the airflow system and install this big unit, and then put it back into the airflow system without reducing the pressure in the system as they create their products. And so, but there's big opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, we have a project in Florida that reduces over 1 million tons a year. It's important. It's impactful that those projects get done. And so the difference being, of course, is that, folks that are buying offsets sometimes need a picture of a beautiful forest or to put on the cover of their sustainability report. I haven't seen Bill's picture on the cover of any sustainability report.
Give it time.
But two things are great, because they're usually a little bit less expensive of an offset than a nature-based product. So if you can include some of these in your portfolio, you can bring your average price down, and you can support nature-based projects and industrial projects that make a big impact. Both are needed, right? If we're going to get to 1.5, however we can reduce emissions, we should be looking at it. So that's a good way to get some volume into your portfolio at a little bit of a lower price to get your average price down. But yeah, we started these projects in order to have them included in the California compliance program back in 2009. And then 3 years later, in 2012, because there was a couple of plants in California, they didn't accept it as an approved methodology. There's only a handful that are approved in California. So then all of a sudden we had to bring them to the voluntary market. And of course, there wasn't much of a voluntary market back then, as Julius alluded to earlier. And there was a few million tons accumulated by then. So that's actually when I came on board to help with that effort. And it's been a fun ride, but you have to find the right buyer for an industrial project. You get a little bit of education. Everybody understands that a tree sequesters carbon. You just got to do some education and really show the quality of the project. And they're really good projects. The reductions are permanent, and that's what we're excited about. They're destroyed; they're never coming back. So it's just a different look at how to reduce carbon, but big impact.
Yeah. I mean, we need all the technologies we can to decarbonize, right? There is no magic bullet here.
Right. That's great.
Yeah. So many US companies are typically looking to offset their emissions domestically or close to home. We've touched on geography a few times. Did we skip a slide? Sorry. Apparently that question got missed in the deck. Apologies. I guess I'll ask you, Dan. Are you how are you seeing people in the market balance the demand for volume of projects with demand for particular parameters, not just geography, but technology as well?
Yeah, it happens. I'm sure Julius attests to this as well, and so would you, Nicole. That happens all the time. I mean, it's very rare that we just get a request that says, "Hey, I need 100,000 tons," and whatever you want to include in that, have feel free. It's usually we need 100,000 tons, and then they'll have some criteria, right?
Hmm.
It needs to be this technology, forestry or industrial or landfill gas or some of the more common, right? I would like it to be in the U.S. Very sometimes we'll get them. They'll say, "Hey, I like it in the Southeast," or I'd like it in New York State, which is kind of impossible. And but in the U.S. or another country, because we have installations there, we actually do a lot of business with European countries who have installations in the U.S. that need part of their portfolio or would like part of their portfolio to be from projects that are in the United States, and
Hmm.
vice versa. So to balance that demand, it's helpful that we, as we spoke earlier, are very collaborative with competitors.
Yep.
So, anything that we have from the projects that we produce will always show the client,
Hmm.
say, would this work for you?
Yep.
But if we don't have it, we can usually source it, as our competitors can usually source it by calling us. And so we have because we have high volume in the United States, a lot of European firms will call us up and say, "Hey, I need X number of tons from a United States project. Do you have anything?" And so I think that's one aspect as far as geography, project type, and all that. I think the big question now is removals and avoidance credits. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, Science-based targets has said that at the end of whatever your target date is, right, whatever's left that you haven't. So let's say you set a science-based target net zero date of 2040. Well, in
Hmm.
2040, whatever you haven't reduced internally yet, you can use removal credits according to the rules to get to zero, which
Hmm.
is cool. And then they also say, hey, you can use any type of carbon credit in between
Yep.
or before that date to get to carbon neutral or to hit whatever your reduction goal is if you haven't been able to reduce internally enough. But because of that end statement that you have to use removals in 2040, let's say, removals have really shot up in price and become the demand for those is really high,
Yep.
uh, and there's not a whole lot of supply available for those compared to avoidance. So at ClimeCo we do both types of projects. So it's
Hmm.
easy for me to sit here and say, we believe in both because
Right.
we actually do. We do both projects, but I don't think we're going to get to 1.5 if we only do removals or if we only do avoidance. As you've alluded to, Nicole, it's all hands on deck. Like everything is needed right now, and if it's credible, then we should support it. And there's different reasons to support both. And so I think that's become a bit one of the criteria that clients are asking for. I like removals. And then if they can afford that, or if they have that in the budget, great. And if not, to not forget about avoidance credits. They're just as valuable. We can't just remove and keep pumping in,
Yep.
and we can't keep pumping in without removing. I mean, they're both so important. So I just like to. We're getting that demand for removal credits quite often,
For
and
sure.
I like to make sure that we don't just quit demanding anything that can reduce emissions. Yeah,
For sure, yeah. And I think something that's important to remember too is you don't just have to buy one type of credit. Like you
that's right.
can you can blend and buy both removals and avoidance credits or across different technologies. You're not locked into like I have X amount of
That's right.
emissions and I have to buy a full volume from this one type of project.
Right. It's actually just like anything else. It's sometimes better to have a diverse portfolio, especially if you're buying from a project before issuance.
Yep,
If you do that
definitely.
all in one basket and it doesn't issue for some reason, or it issues later than you expected, which happens sometimes, um, if you have a portfolio, then most of them will get issued, and that one you'll be waiting on. So yeah, sometimes it's in your favor to have a portfolio.
For sure. Um, and then building upon that, we really dug into geography as well as preferences there. Julius, are there technologies that you're seeing as more viable growth areas for domestic projects?
Sure. Well, I won't harp on grasslands or reforestation any more than I did already. Other ones, and Dan, please chime in here if I miss anything. But there's a lot of old wells out there, fossil fuel wells that need to be capped. They're just leaking methane because regulations weren't stringent enough to make sure they were capped, and so we've got these leaks out there. There's thousands of those. So I know some folks are looking at that to start trying to cap those. There's a lot of interest in biochar right now, which is a way you're basically making charcoal. It's burning wood or other biomass and starving it of oxygen. So instead of releasing carbon into the atmosphere, it's captured in charcoal, and then that can be put places to increase sequestration rates in soil or put in other places so it doesn't get released. Once it's in charcoal, it's a pretty stable form of carbon. So some of those protocols under development. There are some protocols also looking at how can we incentivize fuels reduction on forests in the West that are prone to wildfire. We've had centuries or about a century of wildfire suppression, and a lot of people have chosen to go build homes in areas that are very fire prone, and so we've stopped wildfires to protect those areas. And what that's allowed to happen is a lot of fuel to build up in those forests. So we are seeing increases because of climate change, increased fire, but also because there's a lot of fuel right now out there. And so there's some protocols under development to look at how can you incentivize, people or landowners or companies to go and reduce those fuels, that fuel loading. So cutting out small trees in forests, basically, that don't necessarily pay for themselves because they're not timber. You have to pay someone to go cut them. So how can we incentivize that with carbon offsets to reduce the risk of a catastrophic wildfire that's going to release a ton of carbon, not a ton, but a lot more than 1 ton of carbon into the atmosphere. And so there's also a lot of interest in blue carbon and wetlands, and the protocols are being currently worked on with those. I'm sure I'm missing some, Dan. So
that's okay. We're starting to run tight on time too, so I'll move on to the next question anyway. But there's plenty more technologies to scale. So we've really been focused on the voluntary market here today, but there obviously is a regulatory market as well, where in some cases folks are required to offset and required to purchase certain types of offsets. Julius, can you talk briefly on what the advantages of developing projects in the voluntary space are, as well as maybe dig into just price point a little bit and whether different technologies drive different price points?
Sure. Yeah. So developing projects in the voluntary space for those in that market, it can be less expensive to develop than for the compliance market, because that market is, the rules for that are literally the law. And so, and they haven't really been updated in a while. And so there's some things in there that cause there to be really high prices associated, or the high costs associated with development. So it can be a little bit more efficient to develop voluntary market projects. Now that we've got some demand there, it's a really nice win. And we definitely do see different price points. I think we've alluded to that, but nature-based usually is seeing higher price points because of those co-benefits. A lot of projects in the US are usually a little more higher priced than international projects. Ecosystem Marketplace does a great report, backward-looking report that has that anyone can access, that you can go look at some of the averages. They're global averages, so they don't always have the geography in there. I'm sure they're adding that, but you can definitely see nice breakdowns by technology there.
But yeah, to your point, sometimes the average looks lower than what you're seeing when you're shopping for projects, and a lot of that has to do with different geographies as well as registries. There's a number of factors there that end up driving price.
Yeah, most contracts are bespoke bilateral sales agreements. So and there's not a lot of price transparency in the voluntary space. So that keeps things, I think, pretty far spread.
For sure. And while we're talking about finances here, are developers now getting investments from players outside of the space? Are you starting to see increased funding coming to develop new projects?
Yeah, starting, I think, 2 years ago, we really started seeing a huge influx of interest from all sorts of investors, from banks to private equity to venture capitalism, or venture capitalists, sorry. And also a lot of new development firms coming online, new groups being funded to be trying to be new trading platforms. And they're interested in investing in companies themselves. They're interested in buying offsets and holding them to sell in a year or two. They're interested in funding projects at the beginning of a project. They're interested in funding portfolios of projects. And there's even more funding going towards purchasing land for carbon. We've always had industrial timberlands trading between, basically timber growers, timber companies, and land investment companies that were valuing that off of timber. Now they're starting to buy those properties, looking at it as a carbon investment, carbon and timber, most likely, right? Not purely carbon. And some of these new companies are publicly traded. So it's a nice way for the public to get involved in that. There's also a lot of interest from the blockchain and crypto space. We've seen some big hiccups there this week, obviously, and they do seem to be trying to figure things out. So we'll see what happens there. I don't want to dive into that too much because it's very complicated. And I think they're still trying to figure out their best way into the space, but there is a lot of interest from that sector. Cool.
Thanks so much. So before we hand it over to audience questions, I have a couple of final questions for Dan and Julius. So Dan, I'm going to kick this one to you. What do you see as the biggest challenge to bringing more carbon credits to the market?
That's a great question. It was very interesting. There's a lot of nitric acid plants in the U.S. that would, when we first started doing this in 2009, that would qualify to do project and have quite an impact. Bill Flederbeck, our CEO, started talking to them all, and nobody wanted to be the first one, right? So when we got a few on board, and then it didn't get approved in California, and we started selling them elsewhere. Once those credits sold out, once the other project sites saw that there is a market, people are buying these credits, then they said, yeah, we want to do it. And another one or two would come on each year, and another one would come on but there was always the question, like, the projects that you've been doing, are they selling the credits? Is the market accepting those credits? And so I think a lot of it has to do with people will do a project if they know you only do it. You do it for the right reason also, but you do it because you can sell the credits and you need that in order to do the project. So two things. One, we need the market to continue to buy credits, right? So that more projects will say, yes, I think there's a good investment there. Two, I think we keep tweaking it as what's happened over the last 10, 15 years. And the registries have done a good job at updating their methodologies when they see a little bit, something that could be tweaked to make better. New methodologies coming on to those registries when there's a new opportunity, like we just wrote in a dipic acid protocol for dipic acid plants in the U.S. that was accepted, and now we're doing projects to that without making it too complicated or too hard for a project developer to develop a project. And I think there's a little bit of that in the market right now, where there's a little bit of confusion as people say, hey, the market's not transparent, or the projects are maybe there's one or two projects that weren't really quality that we talked about earlier, but then there's hundreds of projects that are. And so to not label the whole market that way, because if the demand goes down, the new projects go down, and we've defeated the system. Yep. And anyway, I'll stop at that. But I think keep tweaking it to make the market better, but don't come in and make it too hard to develop a project or too burdensome, because you're adding all these new rules and regulations and stuff that has nothing to do with reducing a ton of carbon to what a project developer has to do. And then just making sure that people understand the projects and the demand stays high.
For sure. Julius, I'll hand this next question to you. What are you most excited about with respect to the growth of the carbon market?
I'm excited because I'm a forester by background, and so there's a lot of benefits to forests beyond timber that have never been monetized or valued in a capitalist economy. or any market-based economy, kind of until now. There's been a little bit here and there, but they've been very small. Some red-cockaded woodpeckers in the southeast here and there, but there's really hasn't been a lot. And so carbon is kind of, I think, the carbon markets are a big inroad into really putting a value on the benefit that the planet and ecosystems provide to society. And I think I like to think we're at the tip of the iceberg on that, where we're really starting to value all of those things, all those benefits from ecosystems and having a healthy, functioning natural environment. So I'm excited to see where it goes and how it branches out in that space. I think we're just at the beginning.
Yeah, I love that, and I'm excited by how solution oriented the space is. I mean, even just being able to have conversations like this and talk through the challenges is really, really exciting. So thank you both for taking the time. Before I hand it over to questions, I just want to do a quick plug for our next webinar, which will be January 18th. And here we'll be talking about what actions you can take in 2023 as you work towards your 2040 goals and beyond, really how to set your roadmap and make progress. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to audience questions. But just a reminder that you can connect with all of the panelists. So the first question we have is actually, I'm going to kick it to you, Julius, because you talked about biochar briefly. So we have a question about, have you seen carbon credits using biochar in agriculture, and how might that be measured?
So I have not read the latest iteration on where that methodology is at. So my apologies for not getting prepared on all those little ones that we don't really work on beforehand. But there are some protocols under development, or they're under review right now, and it would be I think you get carbon credits, or your benefit would be from avoiding having what otherwise might decay and just go into the atmosphere as being put into a form of carbon, that charcoal that is much more locked up and can be stored and not released into the atmosphere for a much longer period of time. And that could be potentially spread on agricultural fields to increase, charcoal and carbon, biochar. It can hold on to a lot of other nutrients that plants need. So it can really be a great soil amendment. And so that could be one end use of it. I think there's a question of what are the feedstocks that are coming in, and where would that carbon have gone before being turned into biochar, and then how are they being stored afterwards? I think are the two big pieces there.
Great, thank you. This next one is a really hard one because the answer is so variable, but I'm gonna kick it to whoever wants it. How much can the development of a project cost? And most importantly, the verification process. And I mean, that's a whole spectrum, so.
Yeah, I'll take a quick crack at some of the ones that we're, to put in the technology at a nitric acid plant, depending on the size of the plant, is millions of dollars investment. It's pretty expensive. The plus side of that is that they normally are pretty impactful and reduce a lot of emissions. So still, payback period takes some time, but it's possible because of the high volume. And then, we talk about the shipping credits. Well, you have to bring each ship into dry dock and have the hull altered, right? So it's expensive, A, to do that on a big tanker, and B, it's out of the water. It's not making money while it's doing that. Sure. So it has to be worthwhile. So expensive, and also opportunity loss while the project's taking place, while the alterations are taking place. So I'll stop at that. I think Julius has a better idea of the forestry investments and stuff. I know in the reforestation that we've done, the big investment is in purchasing the seedlings and the labor to get them planted, and it's very expensive up front.
Yeah, for the forestry projects, both your tree planting or your forest management projects where you have a standing forest, just a carbon piece alone is probably going to be several $100,000 to go and measure trees, get the verifier flown out there to measure trees. Sometimes these standing forests, they're really remote. It's not, you can't drive to your plot or anywhere near it. You might be miles from where you need to measure those trees. So those costs can be very high to get a project off the ground. It could easily be $200,000 to over $500,000 before you get a credit. And ongoing verification and monitoring costs are expensive too. So that ongoing verification is in the tens of thousands of dollars. In some cases, could approach $100,000 to get every time you have to go on site, which most of those forestry protocols require every 5 or 6 years to bring a third party auditor on site. And like Dan said, for reforestation, afforestation, depending on what the site looks like, you might be able to squeak by with $250 an acre if things are like perfect to go, flat right by the road. You can go plant it easily to $1,000 or above per acre. If there's a lot of crappy shrubs that have grown in, invasive species you need to deal with, inaccessible, the ground is super compacted. Potentially, maybe it was a mountaintop removal site where they, ran a steamroller over it and compacted everything to close it up. So you really high expenses with all of those.
Yeah, we have a project in Alaska, a forestry project on Frontenac Island. So with the first verification that was going to happen up there that we were involved in, I wanted to go just because I wanted to go to Alaska, right? And so I said, hey, I think we need to do some due diligence on this verification. I need to go. And the guy said, yeah, that's good. The last guy that went, just to tell you the story, you go to Seattle, then you take a little plane to Alaska, the Frontenac Island, then you take a helicopter from there to the island where the forest is. And by the way, the last guy that went with us threw up all over the helicopter because it's pretty bumpy. Then when you get down there, not only do we have the verifiers, but you're surrounded by people with pretty high powered rifles in case there's bear attacks and things like that, because they want to protect the verifiers. And so, yeah, if you want to come, I said, you know what, if you could take some pictures, that'd be wonderful. So, but just think about all those steps and all those extra expenses, and then the expense of a typical forestry verification. But it's important to protect that forest because the forests next to it haven't been protected, and you can see the difference.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And I do see a couple of more questions, but we are actually at time. So I would like to just redirect you to connect with the panelists directly. Feel free to email us at hello@carbonbetter.com, and we can also work to address any other questions. And then also, I just want to say a quick reminder that this session was recorded, so you will be able to access the replay. But thanks again, Julius and Dan, for taking the time. I really appreciate the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you. Quick hour. It went by fast. It was fun.
It did go by fast. Thank you so much. And thanks, audience, for attending. And we will catch you on the next one. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.